Hello, race and ethnicity students. Today we're going to be going over the last exam, exam 4, and doing a quick review. So, like before, I'm going to be jumping around a bit in terms of topics and in terms of authors, as this is a review. It's assumed that you've done the readings, is what I mean by that. All right, we'll start off with the article written by Stuart Wright. Now, Stuart Wright, let's provide some context for this. This article came out, I believe, in 2009, so it's a little over 10 years old. What this article does is it provides a great historical kind of bridge between what was going on in terms of white nationalism and militia movements in the 1990s, then what happens after 9/11 with the militia groups and white nationalists and the interconnections, actually, and the things that they share in common with Muslim extremist groups or jihadist groups. Um, we also end up then seeing that this is something that then leads into much later the documentary that you watched on Netflix, Alt-Right, The Age of Rage. And so this kind of provides this bridge between that time period, the 90s, after 9/11, up until today. Uh, so one of the things that Stuart Wright talks about is the amount of overlap between ideologies of Muslim extremist groups, terrorist groups, and white nationalist terrorist groups. Anti-Semitism or ethnic hatred towards Jewish people being the biggest ideological overlap. And yeah, there are many quotes in the article from people like David Duke, one of the leaders or former leaders of the KKK, who ends up talking about agreeing with Al Qaeda about killing Jewish people. It's if you've not read the article, definitely read the article. Stuart Wright is also demonstrating in his article that racial and ethnic hatred are not just problems in the US, but are global problems. They're all over the world. That racism is a global problem. And this is something also that Bonilla Silva, so I'm jumping around a little bit here, in his chapter 9 in Racism Without Racist, in the most current edition, he discusses how race or the concept of race and racialized social systems used to work differently in different countries. And that with globalization coming out of colonization and imperialism of the West, that more and more countries have become more westernized, and that includes also thinking in terms of this white black color line, and the little bit of the spectrum in between that we end up seeing in terms of the diversity allowed within these racialized social systems. Now, according to Stuart Wright, some of the commonalities that we find between white nationalist militia groups and extremist Muslim terrorist groups, you notice how, militia, terrorist group, these terms are a matter of perspective, because one person's militia is another person's terrorist group, or vice versa. So they share an acceptance of and a willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. There's fear and rejection of anyone who is different from themselves. And ironically, considering the xenophobia, the fear and rejection of anyone seen as different from themselves, they also maintain international social networks. And so while they are xenophobic, they're also international, which on surface appears ironic. Now, Peggy McIntosh wrote the article that you were assigned back originally in 1988, and it has since become a classic statement. It's a huge article. And so um, she was coming from gender studies, women's studies, and she had had a lot of experience dealing with male privilege and talking about and studying male privilege. And through her understanding of male privilege, she was able to see the connections between how white privilege also ends up working. Now, one common experience that Peggy McIntosh reports having is that while many of her colleagues could see the disadvantages that women face, they could not see the reverse side of that, how they were privileged by women being disadvantaged. And that this is the same in terms of talking about white privilege. That white privilege is something that um, many European Americans are not able to actually see for themselves. They might be able to see, for instance, that being a racial or ethnic minority in the United States or any other country for that matter as a disadvantage, but not the flip side of that, which means that the majority group, or the social majority group at least, uh, is privileged by the disadvantaging of the other groups. Now, the famous metaphor now that Peggy McIntosh used was the invisible weightless knapsack, or the invisible knapsack of white privilege. It's really important for students of the sociology of race and ethnicity to be aware of this article and aware of the breakdown, because this really is this classic expression of what white privilege is. There's also a list, and so it's easily understandable, easily digestible. It's a list of, I believe, like 48 items, right? Make sure that you go through and read all of those items, all of that list. Now, I'm not necessarily going to expect you to memorize every last aspect. However, I would expect for questions on the exam for you to be able to identify what is an example of white privilege, according to Peggy McIntosh. Now, as we'll see in later readings, the article, while an important article in and of itself, at this point in time, academic scholars of race and ethnicity have moved beyond even what Peggy McIntosh was talking about, because even within her view, there were things that were intersectional that she didn't really think through fully. So there were things that were, yes, connected to race, but it was also connected to economics, or yes, it was connected to race, but also connected to sexuality. And that's the whole point of scholarship and academia, right? Is to be constantly moving forward to furthering our understanding of these kinds of things. And so now, in terms of intersectionality, things have become even more multidimensional in understanding these sorts of things. All right. So we're going to turn our attention to some of the articles found in Jimenez, Part 4. Um, make sure that you've read the entirety of Part 4. And we have in the article written by Gillum Jackson, Trey Attic, and Juan G. Sanchez Martinez. Um, they're using narratives and stories. And as you all should know by now, I mean, that's a common methodological tool within critical race theory, but beyond that, in terms of qualitative methodology and sociology in general. But their stories are not just current stories or contemporary stories. They're telling stories that go back through history. In talking about the 400 treaties that the U.S. government has signed with the various indigenous tribes of North America, that all 400 have been violated. And they argue that it's not just about tribal sovereignty, though that's certainly a big part of it. It's not just about maintaining culture and language. It's also about protecting the environment generally and protecting the water specifically. And so there is a fundamental difference and how Native American groups understand the land and water and the relationship to it than how the US government, representing capitalistic interest, is understanding land and water and these sorts of things. Um, so make sure that you are reading that article. Also in Jimenez, we have a article written by Maria Joaquina Villaseñor, who demonstrates in talking about Black and Latinx millennials and the stereotypes about the millennial generation being lazy and politically disengaged. And she ends up citing evidence and example after example of how that's simply not true. Um, and she talks about hoodie marches after to protest the killing of Trayvon Martin and the release of George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin. Talking about the die-ins as a reference to sit-ins during the 1960s expression of the civil rights movement, and also being much more doing a lot more social activism online, using social media to organize. And so, very much millennials are very much active in terms of politics and very much engaged. Now, also in Jimenez, Deborah Busman uh, ends up talking directly about Peggy McIntosh's article, but ends up arguing again that there's more complexity here. Um, and she argues that that European Americans have a responsibility to go beyond just realizing their own privilege in a racialized system to actively challenging their privilege, to actively challenging racist social systems. And Busman argues that this can be difficult due to most white Americans growing up racially segregated in white only communities. Of course, there are exceptions, there are always exceptions. We're talking about general patterns as we do in sociology. Also, the ideology of believing in good, bad, binary, where somebody's either racist or they're not, and there's nothing in between. And so, this dichotomous thinking is like, well, I'm not a racist because why? Because you don't put on white sheets and burn crosses in someone's yard. I mean, that's just like the far end version of white supremacy, white nationalism. And there are many small, everyday sorts of ways that this ends up getting expressed. And so, thinking of, well, I've got people who are of minority groups who are my friends. Well, that doesn't mean that you're not racist. And I mean, it's just not that simple. And so, um, believing that there's no room in between, you're either this way or that way, actually gets in the way of understanding how racism works. Also, the belief in individualism, and oftentimes comes with an inability to see one as being a part of a collective identity, such as a racial group. And this ends up leading to what D'Angelo, a major scholar in terms of race and ethnicity, terms white fragility, or the fragility of white people to talk openly and honestly about their own privilege and about racism and how racism works. Now, also found in Jimenez, turning to Melissa Moreno's main points, is that it's important to maintain cultural heritage in areas such as foodways. And so this is one way where we see like ethnic studies intersecting with food studies and the sociology of food. And those of you who are interested, there is a whole area of sociology known as the sociology of food. And it intersects with a lot of different areas, such as ethnic studies, because food ethnicity is about culture. food is a huge part of culture. And so this is what Moreno is trying to get at, is the importance of maintaining the food heritage. Now, also found in Jimenez, looking at Cristobal Salinas Jr., he uses his own stories and experiences, and it's called autoethnography in sociology and anthropology. It can also be another way of looking at it is autobiographical. Um, but he talks about navigating privilege and oppression and how people experience both at different degrees depending on the social context. And so he discusses the ethnic hatred he faced. He discussed the homophobia he faced. He discussed the issues coming to the United States as an immigrant as a child. His parents brought him to the U.S. Now, turning also within Jimenez, the Jimenez readings to Renata Funk. Native American immigrants from Oaxaca, excuse me, to California experienced push and pull factors to immigrate from Oaxaca to California, coming from NAFTA. NAFTA. Now, in immigration studies, what we look at push and pull factors. So push factors are exact and pull factors are exactly what they sound like. They're what's pushing someone to immigrate out of where they are already, and then where they decide to immigrate to. And those would be the pull factors, what's pulling them in. And so we see an incredible increase in the number of Native Americans who are immigrating from Oaxaca to California specifically. And keep in mind, Oaxaca is a state in Mexico, just like California is a state in the United States. Mexico also has a federalist system, just like the U.S. does. So again, that trade agreement is NAFTA. Make sure when you're reading the last parts of Bonilla Silva that he also talks about white segregation in terms of having all white social spaces at all anymore. And he argues that this is an illustration of how European Americans have been segregated by racist social systems as well, and that leads them to miss out on potential relationships and experiences with groups that they would define as racially other. So Chavez readings. Now, there's a lot from Chavez. Make sure that you read the Chavez works carefully. According to Chavez, there's a broad discourse in the U.S. that can be found in mass media, politics, and everyday life based on myths about Latinos, Latinas that he calls the Latino threat narrative. Chavez bases his arguments on data gathered from doing discourse analysis and combining it with demographic research. Chavez argues that the contradiction between the demand for cheap labor, cheap immigrant labor from the business sector, and the legal illegitimacy of those workers due to immigration status results in creating a class of workers who are easily exploited because they have no legal rights. Now, turning our attention for a moment back to Bonilla Silva, one of the things that he found in his research that actually is something that busts stereotypes as well is that he found that among European Americans, the group most likely to be racial progressives are those who would argue for more racial equality and support more racial equality were working class white women. Working class white women. Typically, education is an avenue or into a road into the middle class. And so typically people, and this is not always true, of course, but typically people in the middle class are more highly educated. And so you would expect with a higher level of education, a lower degree or also a higher degree of racial progressiveness. But what we find, or what Bonilla Silva finds, is that it's actually working class women, white women, who are most racially progressive. The Johnson-Reed Act was an expansion of the 1921 Immigration Restriction Act and Emergency Quota Act. This set quotas for immigration at 2% of the population already living in the U.S., which made it much easier for Europeans to immigrate. The express purpose of this legislation was to keep the U.S. as racially and culturally homogenous as possible. Now, keep in mind that the 1921 Immigration Restriction Act and Emergency Quota Act was basing its racialized quotas on the 1890 census. And so, in other words, this was an attempt to keep the United States racially, the racial mixture, at the same level as it was, or the same mixture as it was, if you will, in 1890. Now, a major shift in U.S. Popular discourse about immigration occurred in the 1960s after the INS falsely claimed that there were 10 to 15 million illegal aliens, that was their language, illegal aliens coming into the U.S. And that was proven false. It was a flat out lie. And so immigration discussions on immigration started to shift in the 1960s, largely because the INS was caught lying about immigration. Now, according to Benita Silva, are African Americans colorblind too? He says that African Americans are indirectly, they're not directly colorblind, or they don't buy directly into colorblind racist frames, but they are indirectly influenced because you see aspects of colorblind racist framing in Black communities, such as abstract liberalism. But largely African Americans are aware of and reject colorblind racist frames. Skipping around again, now in the late 1990s, discourse on immigration became even more alarmist because of a rise in both documented and undocumented immigration, fueled by an economic boom that created higher demand for cheap labor. So, again, that would be one of those examples of a pull factor I was talking about earlier. Now, illustrating the social effect of the Latino threat narrative, Chavez cites the example of the Minuteman Project, who in their manifesto stated that they were fighting Mexico's quote unquote Reconquista plan. Now, if you've never heard of this, it's a conspiracy theory that is that a lot of people, Border Patrol people, Minutemen people, those kind of people, and this is connected also to white nationalist militia groups as well, the kind of groups that Stuart Wright was talking about, that he studied. uh, it's believed by these groups that Mexico is trying to reconquer the parts of America that they lost during the Mexican-American War of 1848. Uh, there is no evidence of this. There never has been. It's just this conspiracy theory that many people believe in. Um, all right. Now, make sure to look at the case studies. I'm not going to go through each one, like Juan's case, Carlos's case, Catarina's case. Make sure that you do, though, and that you can identify which case is which. I asked several questions coming from those case studies. Gender, sexuality, and ethnicity combine, according to Chavez, when the Latino threat narrative constructs Latinas specifically as a threat due to the construction of Latinas as being hypersexual and hyperfertile. or the fear that there's not enough white babies. Chavez talks about that fear as well in the book. Illustrating how discourse takes on a dichotomous construction that then becomes linked together, Chavez cites the example of safe and dangerous, legal, illegal, American, Mexican. And this dichotomous thinking then gets linked together in these sorts of ways. So American is someone who's legal and safe, and someone who's Mexican is illegal and dangerous. And so this kind of dichotomous thinking is important for understand. It's important to understand in order to understand how the Latino threat narrative works in American culture. Now, anthropologist Daniel Miller and James G. Carrier, as cited by Chavez, proposed the concept of virtualism as a critique of consumer capitalism, where we create representations of the world, such as in mass media, that are then taken to be real and acted upon, often with the result that the people being constructed or represented are real people who are deeply affected by their construction in mass media, and that they have very little say over. Now, Mary Douglas points out that part of what culture does is categorize people as part of the group or outside of the group. And this can be illustrated in simple language used in talking about immigrant groups, such as referring to immigrants as being aliens instead of just immigrants, immigrant people. And so it's a way of seeing them as being not fully human. While many anti immigration groups claim that undocumented workers are criminals for breaking the law, what they are failing to appreciate is the difference between criminal and civil law. Now, if somebody is deported and they come back, they can be tried under criminal law. But if somebody is crossing into the border, especially for the first time, they're actually violating civil law, not criminal law. And so the argument that they're criminal just for just existing here, no. Immigration law is a part of civil law, not criminal law. Now, turning our attention to Joanne Nagel and looking even more closely at the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Example of white males in North America using co opted and imagined aspects of quote unquote Indian culture to demonstrate their own virile masculinity and power to dominate Native men. Examples of this, and there are many she cites, but just real quick, three examples would be the Boston Tea Party, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, and the Washington Redskins, which recently changed their name to the Washington Football Club because of this, because of an acknowledgement that that's what they were capitalizing on with the team name. The 1855 case of the state of Missouri versus Celia, a slave, and that is the court document's name. That is the court case's name. It was Celia, comma, a slave. That was what was the title of the court case. Is illustrative of the point that Nagel is making, that legitimated institutions such as the judicial system use vague bureaucratic language and outright legal paradoxes so that moral interpretations of events are slanted in the favor of the dominant social group. As an illustration of the historical persistence of the logic of blaming the victim, Nagel cites Edward Long from the 18th century, 1700s, and Richard Perez from the 1950s, who both argued that enslaved black women were the ones who truly had power under the institution of slavery because they were able to use their magical African sexual powers to seduce and control the white men who held them in bondage. Now, this is completely absurd, but it illustrates the power of ideology. That this ideology can be argued in the 1700s and then be argued by a historian in the 1950s as being true. And it's again, it's blaming the victim on steroids. It's saying no, no, the person who has power is not the wealthy white man who is raping the enslaved African woman. It is the African woman who's using her magic sexual powers to. It boggles the mind how even in 1950, but of course, well. 1950 was not necessarily known for being racially progressive. Now, while after the Civil War, formerly enslaved people were technically free, many were kept segregated by the federal government and lived in extreme fear of terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1890s, lynching of African Americans increased in number and were treated as social occasions and family entertainment. There are some really disturbing pictures in the Nagel readings, including postcards with pictures of lynchings with huge mobs of people out just to watch, whole families. And you would end up seeing that people would go and cut off body parts of the person who was lynched and hang them in store windows and take them as souvenirs and have them stuffed in their homes. And I mean, just disgusting things like that. But the North dismissed lynching as being quaint, backward Southern custom. And this continued well into the 20th century. It wasn't just 1890s and the collapse of Reconstruction that caused it. Or, I mean, that wasn't the only time it was occurring. It occurred for an extended period of time. We still see it today. I mean, lynchings occur today at a regular basis. What else do you want to call them? All right. If somebody's targeted because of their race and then they are killed and they weren't a threat to you, they just because the color of their skin, it made them be interpreted as a threat, and they were killed in your mind because of it, or whoever did the killing, that's a lynching. All right, so white people's construction of black sexuality in Europe and later the United States as immoral and savage. That's how they constructed sexuality is ironic considering that at the same time the 17th century, so the 1600s through the 20th century, the 1900s, white controlled institutions were systematically engaging in the castration of males, breeding programs of enslaved African people, and the systemic rape of black females by white men to produce particularly lighter skinned uh, women who would then fetch a much higher price in the slave markets. You heard me right. They were selling their own children. And they were specifically having the children to sell them. And yet it was black sexuality that was immoral and savage. The term that Nagel uses, pornotropics, refers to what European men define the Americas and Africa to be both racially as inferior and sexually as readily exploitable. These were oftentimes, as you'll know from doing the readings, European men during the period of colonization would come into North America or go into Africa, and would end up writing back about how uh, easily sexually exploited it was. Like, she tells the story of Lewis and Clark. We're going to talk about that later. But Lewis and Clark's expedition was basically a big frat party, and actually that makes frat party sound bad because they were going through just raping Native women as they went along. Um, Now, while Europeans were constructing Africans as being quote unquote savages, we have accounts of how Africans saw Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade. One famous account by an enslaved person named Olaudah Equiano saw European culture as being brutal, cruel, and hypersexual. Just watching how the sailors that the European sailors he first came in contact with treated each other, let alone people who were defined as enslaved. We can document the intersections of discourses on race, sexuality, and morality by looking at the quote unquote progressive abolitionist literature of the 18th and 19th century, where the call to end the institution of slavery was expressed not in terms of the moral evils of slavery itself, but the negative effects enslaving and raping others has on the moral standing of whiteness. You heard that correctly. It wasn't because slavery was morally evil itself, but because it had a negative impact on the whites who benefited from holding people enslaved. All right. One of the many ironies of the ideology of manifest destiny is that as it was applied in the US of the 19th century was that while the genocide of Native Americans was occurring simultaneously, so while this genocide was occurring, simultaneously popular and sexually charged novels describing sexual encounters between white women and Native American men were some of the best sellers of the day. Um, White homosocial groups such as fraternities and sporting teams began using stereotyped racial images of Native American men as signs of their white masculinity, and assimilation of Native populations through intermarriage was at times encouraged. All of this are ways of trying to wipe out Native American existence. Now, Christopher Columbus, who, when he first came across the Arawaks, the Native American group, he first came across, we know this from the diaries that he kept at the time, and he started a slave trade immediately with the Native Americans. Um, Within just a generation after Christopher Columbus had come across the Arawaks, they were pretty much all dead. And he particularly noted how the children were made good sexual slaves. That's Christopher Columbus. Now, he described the Americas as being a Garden of Eden. Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian map maker for which the Americas is named, Amerigo Vespucci, described the Americas as being Sodom and Gomorrah. He just saw them as places of wild lust and abandon. Now, while Lewis and Clark, I told you we would talk more about them. While Lewis and Clark expedition was not only about mapping the western part of the North American continent, but also about ethnosexual invasion. Interestingly, some of the native peoples found one member of the expedition, York, highly sexually desirable because he was seen as having immense spiritual power due to his dark skin tone. Even though he was enslaved by Clark, his darker skin tone marked him in these tribal societies as having special spiritual significance. Or, in other words, the native women didn't want to have sex with Lewis and Clark. They did, however, want to have sex with York, the black man who was enslaved by Clark. Now, illustrating global and local nature of ethnosexual violence, Nagel uses a lot of examples, such as the sexualization of Asian women by Western men that fuels sex trafficking and the enslavement of women, particularly from Southeastern Asian countries. The 1987 case of Tawana Brawley, an African American teenager and honor roll student who was violently raped and almost killed by a group of white police officers who carved racial slurs into her body with a knife and smeared feces on her. And a grand jury absurdly decided that Tawana Brawley could have done it to herself, could have repeatedly raped herself, could have cut racial slurs into her body with a knife herself, could have wiped feces all over her own self, torn her own clothes, tied herself into a black trash bag, and then thrown herself onto the side of a highway, which is what had happened to her. And yet, a grand jury decided that there was no evidence to prosecute the police officers that she was able to identify, because she could have done it to herself. Uh, Nagel also uses the example of Bosnia in the early to mid 1990s, where Serbs raped and killed Croatian and Muslim women as a policy of ethnic cleansing, which is just a euphemism for genocide. And they would even say things like, "Well, you're going to have Serbian babies," and so I mean that's the same kind of thing like the English did to the Irish, and the Scottish. And so there are many examples of things along those lines. Now, I do ask questions about rape in the field, such as, main idea kinds of things. So if you've not watched the PBS documentary Rape in the Fields, make sure that you do. Now, the exoticized other is a concept that we find discussed in Nagel, but it's a much broader concept. It's the concept that's loosely related to another concept Nagel discusses, which is the fetishization of race, or turning racialized aspects of a person's appearance into a sexualized desire, or something that is a fetish for. So, somebody saying, for instance, I love Asian men or I love Asian women, for instance, that would be fetishizing someone's race. Why? What about them? I mean, Asian American, Chinese American, which group are you even talking about? No, what they're talking about are racialized characteristics of their appearance, and assumptions they're making about cultural backgrounds. So, So, the exoticized other or fetishization of race can best be defined as highlighting particular aspects of a person's body that are seen through a racial lens, and then paying a backhanded compliment to the person, such as, "Oh, I love your hair, skin, or some other racialized body part. It is so beautiful." That also highlights the feature defined as different or other and situates the person's beauty within a racially defined term of otherness, or racialized terms of otherness. So it's like, "Oh, you're beautiful, but that's because you're different, you're other." But I find it beautiful, so I'm giving you a compliment. Then why are you getting upset? I'm saying something nice. All right. Make sure that you know the difference between an ethnosexual settler, an ethnosexual sojourner, an ethnosexual adventurer, and ethnosexual invaders. Because I ask about each, and I ask you to identify each. And so, if you know these things that I've just discussed, you should do very well on the last exam. Good luck to you all, and have a great winter break.